Bighorn County, Montana, 1876, a date and place etched in the history of America's brutal frontier wars. The Battle of Little Bighorn, often remembered for General Custer's ill-fated stand, hides darker, untold truths about what really occurred on the battlefield. The dead tell their own story here, a gruesome tale of blood, betrayal, and cultural clash. But what truly happened to those left behind? Were the warriors honored as heroes, or were the soldiers left in dishonor? The way the bodies were treated reveals more about the tragedy than many realize. This video will dive into first-hand accounts and testimonies to explore the aftermath of one of the bloodiest confrontations between Native American warriors and the U.S. Army. What was it like to witness the carnage, and how were the fallen warriors and soldiers ultimately remembered or forgotten? A hot June day that would forever change the course of Native American and U.S. history. As the dust settled on the battlefield of the Little Bighorn, a tragic and gruesome scene was revealed. The dead lay scattered, exposed to the elements, their lifeless bodies, a testament to the brutal clash between General George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry and the united Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. But the way in which the dead were treated after the battle tells us far more than the fight itself. It unveils a harsh truth about how life and death were regarded in this conflict. To understand the truth about the dead at Little Bighorn, we need to look at the broader context. The battle was just one event in a long history of broken promises, treaties, and injustices. Native American tribes like the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, and others had long resisted American expansion into their sacred lands. These tribes were not only renowned for their warrior skills, but also fiercely protective of their land and culture. Years before, in 1851, the Fort Laramie Treaty was supposed to bring peace by outlining the boundaries of native lands and preventing American encroachment. But after gold was discovered on these lands, the U.S. government, settlers, and miners ignored the treaty. The growing resentment among the tribes finally led to the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. But even this was shattered when white settlers moved into the Black Hills, sacred to the Lakota. By the summer of 1876, tension had reached a boiling point. The U.S. military was under pressure to bring the tribes to heel. Custer and his 7th Cavalry were dispatched to confront the native coalition, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who refused to give up their lands without a fight. On June 25th, Custer launched a surprise attack on a large native encampment along the Little Bighorn River. His intelligence was tragically flawed. He believed there were only a few hundred warriors in the camp, when in fact there were over 2,000, many armed with superior rifles. Custer's forces were quickly surrounded, outnumbered, and annihilated within an hour. But what happened after the battle is where the untold truth lies. With no survivors from Custer's detachment to recount their final moments, native oral histories and the reports from those who arrived later paint a grim picture. Custer's body, along with 210 of his men, was found brutally mutilated, a stark reminder of the fierce retaliation for years of broken treaties and war. The Lakota and Cheyenne, following their customs, stripped the bodies of their enemies, removing clothing, weapons, and personal belongings. But the mutilation that followed was particularly symbolic. Soldiers had their trigger fingers cut off, ensuring they could not fight in the afterlife. Custer himself, a figure both reviled and respected, had knitting needles jammed into his ears, perhaps a symbolic message that he had refused to listen to native grievances, and an arrow placed through his genitals, a mark of humiliation. These gruesome acts were not just revenge, they were deeply rooted in cultural beliefs about the afterlife, punishment, and protection of their people from further harm. The bodies of Custer and his men were left on the battlefield for days, exposed to the brutal Montana summer heat and scavengers. The U.S. government's response was slow, and when soldiers finally returned to bury the dead, they were met with a grisly sight. Decomposed and half-eaten by animals, the remains were hastily buried in shallow graves. Custer's body, identified by his long hair and personalized gear, was given a slightly deeper grave, just 18 inches deep. Captain Frederick Benteen, who arrived days later, reported that the rains of the Montana season soon washed away these shallow graves, exposing the remains once again. Calls for a proper burial grew louder, and finally, in 1877, the the remains were moved to deeper graves or transported to nearby forts. Custer's body was reinterred at West Point, where he remains today. The Battle of Little Bighorn was a victory for the Lakota and Cheyenne, but it was bittersweet. They knew this victory would bring harsher retaliation from the U.S. government, which indeed sent more troops to seize their lands and break their resistance. Within a year, most of the native warriors had been forced to surrender, and their lands, including the sacred Black Hills, were taken with no compensation. The dead at Little Bighorn became martyrs in American law, brave soldiers who fell in battle. But for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and other native peoples, this was yet another painful chapter in a long history of betrayal and violence against their way of life. As we reflect on the untold truth of the dead at Little Bighorn, it's vital to remember the cultural significance of the battle. For Native Americans, this wasn't just a fight against the U.S. military. It was a defense of their land, their people, and their way of life. The dead, both Native and U.S. soldiers, deserve to be remembered with the respect that history sometimes fails to give. This battle is more than just a historical event. It represents the clash between two worlds, two cultures, each fighting for survival. The story of the dead at Little Bighorn reminds us of the cost of broken promises and the resilience of those who stood their ground. Let's honor the memory of all who fell at Little Bighorn and continue to learn from the past. If you enjoyed this video and want to support iRich History, please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell for more videos, and share this history with others.